Joining us now will be Mr. Pranay Lekhi. Pranay is a legal advisor of Alumni of Cambridge International Law Firm. He has done his LLM from the University of Cambridge International Law. He is an amazing public speaker. He's won almost every competition. I've seen Pranay debating when I was growing up, and I can guarantee that it's amazing. And Pranay has represented his university in chess at the Philip J. Jason International Law. He's obviously a Cambridge debater, and he's just amazing. Pranay, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Well, Pranay is a legal advisor of University International Law. He has done his LLM from the University of Cambridge International Law. He is an amazing public speaker.
I think your Pranay is facing a lot of technical difficulty. I think you muted Pranay.
He's obviously a Cambridge debater, and he's just amazing. Pranay, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Samir. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Pranay. The Indian kids who are my solid debaters, So, Pranay, my first question to you is, I want to talk to you about your journey. How did you get into debating? How's the journey been? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a really interesting or invigorating journey. It's primarily because I was always interested in public speaking, and I knew from a very early age that I wanted to become a lawyer, and I felt the most transferable skill that you could get from school was if you have a chance to speak in public. And so I did a lot of public speaking while I was growing up, of course. And after my first debate, the kick was so high that I just got hooked, and I did it virtually every day I was in school with you. And I had great fun doing it. But yeah, I mean, I think that the unique thing about debating, which really got me hooked to it, was the ability to think critically. I think it's an essential skill that every young person must have, and something that we see less and less of these days. But I fully support the idea of as many people coming into public speaking competitions like debates to develop that sort of thought process that could help you formulate opinions and arguments.
Thank you so much, Pranay. Questions about the roles of each speakers, how speakers can improve their speech. So the first question I want to ask you is that developing a good rhetoric, getting that command over the language, increasing that vocabulary, being comfortable with how you talk, it takes years of practice. We have a lot of novice debaters today, first-time debaters in school. What is your tip to them? How can they improve their language skills? How can they become better debaters?
That's a very good question, because a lot of times, at least this is what I've experienced, people feel that public speaking skills and confidence to speak at debates is somehow acquired, and it's a talent that is not necessarily something that can be developed. People are born with it often, and I don't think there can be a greater misconception of that. I was not the sort of speaker that I am today 10 years ago, and I have grown and developed by watching other much better speakers speak and learning from them, and having the ability to immerse myself in every single situation, knowing that I'm going to learn. I'll share a very funny anecdote. So when I was a lot younger, I used to watch The Big Bang Theory, and you had Sheldon Cooper coming in with those zingers every time, right?
Yeah.
And for me, of course, I watched it for the comedic value of it, but I remember keeping a very long notepad and noting down each and every one of those zingers that he came with, and I used many of them in my debates. So they were those unique sort of comments and rhetorical devices that make you sound more intelligent than you are. And it gives you just the sort of flair that other people might not have heard it, especially the judges who are 50, 60-year-old individuals who are judging you were probably not watching The Big Bang Theory. All of a sudden, if you talk about homunculus fallacies and a toad not turning into a prince and things like that, I feel it adds that sort of flair in your argumentation. So there are places that you won't often realize that you can learn from, that you can actually learn from. Of course, see debates on YouTube. That's the primary source of most of my inspirations. I used to watch a lot of Prime Minister's questions of the UK Parliament, and they often had very great quips, which are very transferable to debates as well. And yeah, so I mean, the way you develop rhetoric is, of course, you pointed out at two of the most common ways of doing it. One is by reading, and the other is by listening. So you read a lot of books, you get your information. As soon as you are confident enough about your knowledge base, you're automatically going to be equally confident about your ability to speak on a facet or a topic. So it is important for you to keep developing your knowledge and always realize that you can never know enough. So have that sort of humility where you feel that, oh, I know everything, should never come into the picture. But besides that, I think there are many unique places that you can learn from, and just keep an eye out and an ear open for anything that you think could help you develop. And of course, practice makes perfect. So the more you do these things, the better you'd get.
So I've seen a lot of the senior debaters that tell me that after a few of their debates, let's say they've been in the circuit for 1 or 2 years, they take a break for 2-3 years. When they come back, they sort of lost that rhetoric. How do you make sure? How do you polish a rhetoric throughout that? How do you maintain that command of the language?
Yeah, I mean, so there are two ways of looking at it. One is that the command over the language that you may have is not necessarily the be-all or end-all of your debating skills. I know of many people who did not have the most posh English accent or manner of speaking, who were exceptionally good debaters, primarily because their thought process was so good that the way you handle the language starts mattering a lot less if your quality of argumentation goes up. Which is why, I mean, English is not supposed to be our first language. If there is a degree of discomfort that you feel in speaking it, it should never be a source of shame. As long as you have, as I said, the ability to think well and argue better. So if your arguments are logical, if they are strong, and you are in a position that you are able to communicate them effectively, it should never be a problem if you've not got the rhetorical flair or not. Of course, rhetorical flair makes it a lot more exciting and interesting, and it'll make you a better speaker, but it would not take away from the sort of argumentation that you have. The other thing that you spoke about was not doing it often enough, and therefore developing some ring rust, as it were. And that does happen. For instance, even for me, I debated in my undergraduate university for a relatively long time, and then I didn't for a substantially longer period of time. And it does take you a little bit of time getting back into the groove of parliamentary debating specifically, only because, I mean, the format is pretty unique and it's not something that you will get a chance to do often. A 7-minute speech with other people hearing you intently is not something that we get to do in our daily lives. So again, as I said, the more you practice, the better it'll get, and you'll be able to get out of that rust a lot sooner.
That's great. I want to ask you about how do you deconstruct a motion? So let's say you've got a topic, this is your first reading. What is the strategy goes behind deconstructing it? What is your initial response to a motion? How do you plan out your research strategy? How do you frame your argument? What is the thinking behind it? Your first initial response to a motion?
Yeah, that's a good question, because if you're dealing specifically with parliamentary debates, if I'm not too sure of the format that you'll be following, but we were given the motions 15 minutes before our actual speech, 15 or 20 minutes before our actual speech. So a lot of our research is already done in the sort of readings that we do in our daily lives. So it's keeping up to date with the news, making sure that you try to read the newspaper in some form, physical or electronic, and then so that research base is already covered. You can't really add much in a 15-minute period where you're not allowed any access to the internet or phones to really develop a sort of research-based argument. Therefore, the best way that I used to approach my motions was that there were certain words that used to just pop up. So it was, this house believes that X, Y, Z. So in that motion, I would find words which would have opposite meanings to try to understand what is the sort of different arguments that can come through. For instance, if we take the motion that you were discussing about developed countries, the opposite to that would be developing countries or underdeveloped countries. What would be the impact in those nations? And you gave very good examples of places like Venezuela, etc. So a lot of the times that when you see the motion for the first time, look at the specific individual words. So breaking down a motion is quite simply how you would break down a sentence. Take out the nouns from it, see what you know about it, then look at the conjunction and the words and see how you can flip them around to develop your arguments. So as long as you have the ability to think laterally in terms of when you're looking at those individual words, you will be in a relatively good place while developing your arguments as well.
Can we have a live deconstructing session? If I give you a motion right now, can you just drive us through how you would deconstruct it, what's going on in your mind?
Sure.
So the motion we'll be having today is this House believes that social media is a valid instrument to herald change in society.
Okay. I think you've done me easy over here because it's a very obvious motion. So you said this House believes that social media is a valid instrument to herald change in society.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So the first thing I would always do, which is what I'm doing right now as well, is write down the motion, because it's always good to have it in front of you when you're trying to deconstruct the actual essence of it. So of course, the words that pop out at me are social media, valid instrument. What is valid or invalid about the instrument? If I'm thinking, what is the motion getting at when it says valid instrument, or what can be the possible things that would invalidate this as an instrument? I'm thinking of, in terms of examples, India specific. I'm thinking of the Shaheen Bagh riots. I am thinking of mobilization on sectarian lines. I am thinking of Baba Ka Dhaba recently, for instance. So, a lot of examples come into mind when I think on a global perspective. I, of course, think about the Arab Spring, the presidential election in the United States, as everywhere in the world, the curbs on freedom of expression in China. So then these are the examples that I'm getting on social media, right? Change in society. So change is a neutral word. It can have both a positive and a negative connotation, right? If you're saying it's a valid instrument to get negative changes, that will often be a very good way of approaching this motion, because what someone who will be thinking directly at the motion would think that if I'm in opposition, all I need to say is that social media would bring bad changes, right?
That's a very good tip. That's an amazing tip.
But if I'm in proposition, I can say that social media is a valid instrument to bring bad changes as well, right? And at that point, the opposition, when they hear the first speaker, they would be completely dumbfounded, because of course you did not prepare for that sort of argumentation. And that's what I mean when I say think laterally. So if you look at the word change, it's a neutral word. Always think of all sorts of connotations of every single word. Valid is not a neutral word, right? Valid is there can only be one connotation of the word valid. It's correct, right? So for those sort of words, if you're in opposition, think of the opposite or the antonym of it. But that is how I'd go about deconstructing emotion. Just write it down, take every individual word at face value, and try to see every sort of different connotation that you can have about it, and then finally move on to thinking about examples in your daily life which you can use as constructive arguments.
So let's say that you've deconstructed the motion, you have your points in mind. How do you frame your argument? So let's say the proposition, the Prime Minister, you've done your thought process, you're ready with your points, you've done your research. How do you frame the argument? What do you want to start with?
So if I'm a first speaker, if I go as the Prime Minister, it's a relatively easy job for me, primarily because the format of my speech is already predetermined. There are certain things that I have to do by virtue of my role. Those things include giving my team's arguments. So I will be listing out all the arguments that my team is going to be putting forward. So I have to list that out. That's something that my role demands. Another thing that my role demands is often defining the house, which I mean, not a lot of people do these days, but it's something that can be done. Defining terms of the motion. So when I say change, what we mean by change is only positive change and not negative change, for instance. Or you could say that what we mean by change is both positive and negative change. So therefore, you have to define certain terms that you're giving to the motion. That's something that your role warrants. The third thing that your role warrants is what you're going to be saying itself. So besides the team structure and definition of the motion, you also have your own constructive arguments. In that context, I feel the Prime Minister's speech is already predetermined, and there are a lot of parts of it that you can think about beforehand. So know that you have to do these certain things as part of your role and focus on them. When you're a second speaker or a constructive speaker, at that point you have two roles that you have to accomplish. First is rebutting the points of the first speaker and also giving your own side's constructives, right? So let's say the Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition are done, now a member of government. So they have two things to do, including the idea of giving your own constructives. You also have to rebut the arguments of the Leader of the Opposition. So you already have that set, that you know that you're going to be giving rebuttals and you're going to be giving your constructive arguments. It's often a good strategy to start with your rebuttals, primarily because they'll be fresh in the mind of the adjudicators. They will have already heard the speech, and if you can break it down right at the beginning, it becomes a lot easier rather than doing it at the end. So it's always a good idea to begin with rebuttals and then move on to your constructives. How I would structure my speech, and this is something that has changed over the years. I was, like most people usually are when they're starting out speaking, I used to write down every single word that I had to say, and then try to memorize it or try to develop on it a lot better. So of course that changes when you only have 15 minutes to prepare your speech, right? You can't possibly write every single word of a 7-minute speech. I mean, I took days writing a 3-minute speech when I was a lot younger. It's impossible to do in 15 minutes. So, I mean, my preparation of writing was usually very, very basic. I invariably only had 3 points on my paper, and that was it. It was literally 3 bullet points. I never wrote more. And I think that comes a lot with confidence and practice. So you can reach that stage where you can just write 3 points and have faith in your rhetorical ability, as you put it, to be able to just speak on those points without any sort of hiccups. But of course, if you've not reached that stage, it's always a good idea to develop on those bullet points a little bit more. So instead of 3 bullet points, you can have 3 main bullet points and have 3 sub-bullet points within that. So let's say you have 3 constructive arguments. Within those 3 constructive arguments, you have 3 sub-arguments or examples. You can note those down as well. Anything that gives you comfort. But I wouldn't suggest writing down your entire speeches or even trying to write down your entire speeches. Go with the flow. Give yourself the flexibility to even answer questions that may be put, and have some degree of confidence in your ability to know what your arguments are, because at the end of the day, they're coming from your own mind and no one's putting them in. So you'd often be in a good place to develop most of your arguments.
Although we're probably given the motions either an hour before the debate or a day before the debate. But I think this is still a great practice to start off with, writing your bullet points at this stage as well, even for the novice debaters. So my next question, Pranay, is that we've spoken about the role of the Prime Minister, we've spoken about the role of the Constructives. Let's talk about the leader of the opposition. A, what is the responsibility of the leader of the opposition? B, now let's say the way you changed the motion when I spoke about this, with the social media motion, where you really changed the meaning of the word change itself. How, as an opposition, I'm completely dumbfounded. I'm on the spot. I have to react to this. I have to save my team. How can I react to this? What is my roles and responsibilities? And what are the tips you would give to a leader of opposition?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as opposition, you would focus on a different word, right? You would not focus on the word change, but focus on the word valid, and talk about how the proposition's arguments would be self-defeating if you're speaking about valid instruments of change. It would be in a position of complete disharmony with the motion as such if we just look at change in both the positive and the negative connotation. That's not the burden that the motion puts on the proposition. But of course, I mean, the reason why I said this motion is a little bit obvious. It's not something that you would often find, and I'm sure you would know, in a parliamentary debate as such, only because of the vagaries of the motion itself. But if the leader of the opposition does come across, and it often happens, with a completely obscure definition of a motion, the best way to approach it is continue with your arguments to the best of your ability and try to show how the interpretation of the definition of the proposition is incorrect and it does not satisfy the burden that the motion puts on the proposition. Therefore, as the leader of the opposition, again, you have two things that you have to do as your role. The first, you don't have to define the house because you can't, and you cannot challenge the definitions of the proposition because that's not what your role is. Your role is to be set in the motion that is defined by the proposition, unless the definition is so obscure that a debate is impossible, and that threshold is never reached. So don't even try to dispute the definitions of the motion, because I am a firm believer that there is always scope for debate in whichever sort of definition or proposition puts through. So the first thing is that you give your team's arguments. That's again something that you have to do as leader of the opposition. So you'll be listing out, let's say my team has 4 constructive points, A, B, C, D. I will be speaking about A and B. So this is something that you have to do as the leader of the opposition. The second thing that you would do is probably give your own constructives. And again, a very similar structure. I love leader of the opposition speeches. Like LO speeches, in my opinion, are the most fun to do because you set the debate for your side and you also get a chance to rebut, which is something that the Prime Minister never gets to do at all. So I find the LO to be a very important speaker, as well as the member of government. Those two speeches are very important in the context of a debate because simply because of being the first points of rebuttal in the debate. But as LO, what I recommend you do is that you take the definition that's been set by the proposition, think on your feet if it's something very obscure, and have the confidence in your own arguments to believe that you would still be able to carry the motion or defeat the motion if you're opposition, even in a context of an obscurely defined debate, which you will not find a lot of, in fairness.
I understand. Thank you so much. Great points. The role of a rebuttal speech. They say that debates are won during rebuttals. You can't bring up new arguments or to summarize your arguments. It's a very important speech. How can you ace this speech as the leader of the opposition, going second last, and as a Prime Minister who's going last?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are a few tips and tricks that you can use when you're starting out as a rebuttal speaker. Again, rebuttal is an exceptionally fun speech to give because you just have to destroy the argument of the other side or try to destroy the argument of the other side. So it's a lot to do with deconstruction of arguments. There are a couple of ways you can do this. First is you could do a best case, worst case scenario if you're opposition, let's say. So you take whatever the proposition is argued and say that in the best case scenario, this would happen. If we take their definition at face value, in the best case scenario, this would happen, and why that best case is not good enough, right? So you've given them the benefit of the doubt. You've said that we will take everything you've said at face value, but still you are unable to carry this motion. So that's the best case scenario. After your best case scenario is over, you get the worst case scenario, right? So if we take the proposition's argument to the logical conclusion in the worst way possible, this is what will happen. And mind you, both things are possible in a debate, right? So if a motion gets carried, both the best case and the worst case would be possible. So you need to say that A, best case is not good enough. Worst case is so bad that this motion should never be carried, right? So that's one strategy, that you can always go best case, worst case. The second thing that you can do is do a stakeholder analysis. So every motion would have certain stakeholders. For instance, a human rights motion would have people who are erstwhile excluded from status quo exercise of rights, for instance, the vulnerable sections of society. In an education motion, which is the most obvious one for stakeholders, is you have students and teachers in schools, right? So you have three stakeholders in this debate. Let's say it's an education motion. So you'll have students, teachers, and schools. Both as a proposition or as an opposition speaker, you could see how the motion would impact each of those stakeholders, and depending on which side you're on, you may be able to carry your points through. So you'd be able to say that the stakeholder, like students as stakeholders, will be impacted in a good way or a bad way by virtue of these arguments that have been given. So those are the sort of things that you could do in a situation where you're completely lost on thoughts and words. So always think of what are the stakeholders in this debate, think of best case, worst case scenario. Then of course there is the third way of going about it, which is what a lot of people do in most situations, and that is they suggest and try to find out essentially the rebuttals to the speeches again. So it's a rehash of some sort of the debate that's gone by. So as you said, it's a summary of the debate. What I would say is it's not just a summary of the debate, it is a biased summary of the debate. So it is, you are trying to show not what happened in the debate, but you're trying to show the reason why you won because of what happened in the debate, right? So as a bias summary, what I would suggest is that you pick your best arguments and say how they answer all the points that have been raised by the other side. It's often a good idea to see what your case theory is. So this is often one sentence of the idea that you're trying to carry forward. So if you have a nice, succinct case theory in your own head, this is not something that you need to say out loud or write down. But if you know that what is the point that you're trying to carry, it's often a good way to structure your rebuttal speeches around it, because you're able to think, okay, what I'm trying to say is this, and this is how I've said it, and this is how the other side have not been in a position to deny it. So those are the few things that you can do. As you said, in a rebuttal speech, never try to bring in new arguments or new analysis, because the propriety in debating is always that you should give the other side an adequate opportunity to respond to your arguments. And if that is the case, if you bring out any new matter in the rebuttal speeches, then it becomes very hard for any side to respond to it. So that's why I would recommend that you avoid doing it in the rebuttal speeches. And yeah, those are about all the things that I had in mind about the rebuttal speeches.
Thank you so much. Points of information, questions that can turn the tide of the debate in your favor. How can you ask a good question? What is the mechanism? How do you think of a good question? And suppose you receive a question which you're stumped with. How do you respond to that? Should you just move on and completely ignore it? How do I sort of divert the attention from a good question and not negatively get marked for it?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to respond to a good question is with a good answer, and that's very obvious. But there again, points of information for young debaters who are starting out. They can be these tools that are often very misused, and I'm guilty of it. When I was doing one of my first parliamentary debates, I have this tendency of being very flustered and frustrated in debates. And I used to misuse the points of information a lot, which is not a good strategy. You never want to heckle anyone when they're speaking. That's a very, very bad idea. Also, it's just not good because you get marked down for it. You get marked down for behaving badly in a debate. So always have the ability to keep your chin up. If someone is arguing well, you don't need to trouble them by points of information. Only ask points if you have a good point to make. But I do recommend asking points of information. I mean, with those introductory things, the way you ask a point of information first, and then I'll move on to how you answer it, is that, again, this all depends a lot on what your case theory is. For instance, if someone is just running away, you see the judge nod to an argument that is completely opposed to what you're trying to say, ask a question that's at the fundamental root of the argument that's being made over here. For instance, taking your example again about developing countries and capitalist economies, for instance, you can say, if someone is saying that no, the capitalist economies are terrible for developing countries, the root of that would be possibly with an example. Let's see India's condition pre-91 and post-91, right? So what do you have to say on that? Things like that. So basically, if you attack the root of an argument, that's a great point of information, invariably a very good one. How you answer it is that, for instance, let's take the question of 91 economy. We look at India's economy today, it's shrunk by 24%, right? So when you're debating, you have to have the ability to first preempt every sort of question that comes before you, and the second is that you need to be confident. If you're confident enough in your arguments that you're making, you'll be able to find an answer to them. It's never going to be a difficult thing to answer, because more often than not, most of the questions that you will be asked, these are things that you would have thought through. And by virtue of you thinking them through, it'll often be very easy for you to think of an answer as well. If you do get stumped, which which could happen, the best way of dealing with it is not being dismissive of the question, but by suggesting that it will be answered in the course of the speech, or saying that I understand the question, and move on to your own arguments that you were doing and say that that's the answer. No one really thinks through those things too much for it to be a problem.
I understand. Thank you so much for all your tips, Pranay. Let's talk about a little bit about how debating has helped you professionally. Has it shaped your professional life, you feel?
Yeah, I mean, to a great degree. Primarily because, I'm not too sure, because I was thinking about this just before I joined, whether I knew I wanted to become a lawyer before I started debating or after. But I know one feeds into the other, right? And it's not only the legal profession which benefits out of an ability to think critically that develops as a course of debating, right? As I said, that's the primary skill that you gain as soon as you start debating a lot more than you do already, right? The ability to think your thoughts through. And that has a direct application on anything that you would do in your life. It has personally helped me a lot, because speaking is something that's an integral part of the profession that I'm in, just by virtue of the profession being what it is. So that's the direct application of that. But the psychological development that happens as a course of doing activities like debating is something that I find so necessary and transferable in most activities that we will be doing in our lives. It just makes you more sentient creatures as humans. It just allows you to develop your mind a lot more. And as soon as you get interested in the activity, there's no stopping you. It only gets better. So any profession that you would want to do in your life, it doesn't have to be something that involves speaking. It can be your business interests. It can be entrepreneurship. You might want to start things. The ability to think critically is a core skill that everyone must possess, and debating at the school level and when you're in an educational institution, that's one of the best ways that you get to develop it, because I don't think that we get a chance to do a lot of it in our classroom settings. So it's always a very good idea to just move outside of it and use these co-curricular activities for that purpose.
understand. MUNing, debating, moot courts, parliamentary debates, you did it all. What is your favorite format of competitive speaking and why?
Okay, I mean, I'm not too sure how to answer this when you're organizing a parliamentary debate competition, but I've always found parliamentary debating to be one of the easier things that I did in law school. I found mooting was a more, I mean, that's a law school specific activity, but it's just something that possibly every law student in India at least has to do. So I found mooting more invigorating just because of the degree of research that you had to do before you presented your arguments. As opposed to debating when you're given, as you said, a relatively shorter period of time. For moots, we work over months and months to eventually finalize and formulate our arguments, and there are written submissions that have to be given. And it's a lot more encompassing, but I guess the idea is the same as debating, right? The skill that you're developing is exactly the same as debating. You are essentially in a position where you are thinking of arguments that logically flow to make a point. And because the core idea remains the same in debating, mooting, and most other competitive speaking activities, any one of them is interchangeable with the other. But one thing that I would always recommend that you guard against is never let the activity become bigger than yourself. For instance, I mean, I've noticed this a lot. You would know this in school. We had activities that often dictated your social capital in school. How popular you were was dictated by if you did NUNs or if you went for debates. Very similar in law school as well. Your popularity often depended on whether you did well at moots or debates or not. And I've always found that exceptionally annoying. Exceptionally annoying. I think do these activities for the sake of what the activity gives to you. They help you inculcate immense number of skills that will hold you in very good stead in the future, but don't do it for these very vain reasons, which will really
do it for the passion of debating. Do it for the passion.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even passion. Do it more selfishly. You don't have to do anything for the passion of these activities. Do it selfishly in the sense that these activities will help you personally a lot, both in terms of the development of your personality as well as your thinking. So do everything selfishly in an idea of personal growth. Don't do it for ulterior motives, because at the end of the day, you'll realize when you're out of your own bubbles and you start living life on your own terms, it won't matter how popular you were in school or in college. And that's the only thing that I would like everyone to keep in mind.
Cambridge Union Debate. I saw your LinkedIn post today. It's been exactly 1 year. Tell us about that. How was that? How did it feel being in front of so many people from around the world? Tell the audience a bit about that, please.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and it was so strange that we were talking about debating today, and it was exactly a year ago today that I possibly at this time I was getting ready for the Cambridge Union. How that came about was that I landed in Cambridge for my master's about 5 days earlier, and I got to know that there were auditions happening for the annual No Confidence debate. And this is the debate that happens every year at both Cambridge and Oxford in their respective unions on whether this house has confidence in Her Majesty's government. And I, coming from India, would never miss an opportunity to speak on the UK government to British citizens. I don't know what I was thinking, to be honest, but I knew that debating at the union is something that I wanted to do. It was one of the driving factors for me applying to these universities. So therefore, I decided that I'll go for the auditions, and then the auditions went well, and I had a chance to speak. And it was an absolutely fantastic experience. It was everything that I imagined it to be. I got to wear a tuxedo on the Cambridge Union floor, and then I spoke at people, which was a lot of fun because I like doing that. Um, and yeah, and it was very well received, and it was my first big thing that I did at Cambridge. And it was everything that I imagined it to be. It was a culmination of a lot of speaking in the years that have gone by, but it was the most surreal experience that I had, and something that I would do again and again.
Could you tell us a little bit about the culture of unions? You mentioned about the Cambridge Union, Oxford Union. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, unions are primarily like societies in any other educational institute that you will have. So, you'll have clubs and societies. The union is exactly like that. The union does not engage in parliamentary debates in the way that you guys are. This is a lot more. I think it's a harder format because giving speech on the basis of preparation of either an hour or even 24 hours is not the same as you having the opportunity to sit with a topic and think about it over a few days. Like I said, I had about 4.5, 5 days to prepare. And I had to give a 10-minute speech, which was not the most difficult thing in the world because, as I said, because you have enough time to do your research and think through your arguments and see what your main case point is. So the unions work differently from parliamentary debates as such. Parliamentary debates are a lot more taxing, and they're a lot more intense than a union debate. The union debate also, I mean, obviously has the advantage of having more viewership. So, of course, if you're debating at the union, you'll be debating in front of many more people than you would in a parliamentary debate, which is often invariably going to be you, the other team, and the adjudicators. But the culture of the union, so the motto of the Cambridge Union is protecting free speech since the early 19th century, and this was the first union that was made for debating in the world. So it was even before the Oxford Union. And in that essence, what it basically drives towards is not the formats of the debates or anything as such. They pride themselves more on the events that they organize, and the events that they organize are getting amazing speakers from around the world, organizing weekly debates which are open to every member of Cambridge as well as for specific members of the Cambridge Union. And the idea is not to speak at these events, but the idea is that when you go to these events and listen, you'll probably learn a lot more than you would have just speaking at them. And again, that is what a very important lesson is, that you open your mind to newer ideas and thoughts when you listen a lot more, and that obviously is a core tenet of any sort of debating that you would do.
I recommend everybody to check out Pranay's debate at the Cambridge Union. We'll be forwarding it on the group. Pranay, tell us a little about what are your tips for the budding lawyers over here. We have a lot of students in high school, a lot of students who have done degrees such as political science and get into law. Tell us a little bit about this field. Tell us what are your tips for them.
Yeah, so it's not the easiest profession to get into because you require some sort of a footing when you start out. But now law has opened up to so many avenues, both in terms of you can be a corporate lawyer or you can be a litigator, which is that you can be in courts, and that eventually you will need to figure out what interests you the most. If you are a budding lawyer, that means that you already have some sort of an interest in the legal profession. And that is the first and most important thing that you need to possess. If as soon as and as long as you have an actual inclination towards your professional life, you will definitely be doing well at it. Because that means that you will not be shying away from the effort that is required to be put in to succeed at a profession. Law requires a lot of reading and the ability to think through your arguments whenever you make them, especially if you are going to go down the path of litigation. So what I did throughout my school life, as well as during my undergraduate degree, which was of course in law, is that I never shied away from putting in academic effort, which means that it was studying for me was never a pain. It was something that I did willingly, and I knew that I was doing it for a purpose. So if you have purposive action to everything that you do, you will often be very good at it. So I would suggest that any activity you do, always try to see what is the purpose behind it. And if that purpose matches your interests in, it can be the legal profession or any other profession, then choose to pursue it a lot more. Of course, if you are getting into law university, then it requires a different sort of preparation for your entrance exams and things like that. But just by virtue of the number of very good law universities that have opened up both in the private sector as well as the number of government law universities that are increasing, that would never be an issue for a meritorious student. So just be very passionate, remain passionate about the law as long as you are in the profession. I wake up still very passionate about doing law. I wake up very interested in it. And as long as you have the ability and thought process of remaining passionate about the profession, you will definitely do well at it.
What do you towards it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I when I was a lot younger, I always thought that international law. I never really understood the connotations of what international law is. Um, for me, it was something that was more global, which it is. But I never knew that the number of fields that existed within the spectrum. Um, so consequently, my initial preference towards international law was because of my almost penchant to do international law moves. And in that, for that end, I decided to do an international law course in the first year of my undergraduate degree, and then I just got hooked. I loved everything about the subject. I loved the interplay of politics, international relations, and law in the field. My recent research is about the irrelevance of the norms of international law and the need to rework it. I thought that this area is so nebulous and so underdeveloped, despite the vast number of readings in it since God knows how long, since we could even think since 19th, 18th centuries or even earlier than that. So it's despite having such a long history, the true development of international law and international legal politics only developed after the coming in of the United Nations, which is post World War II, and that's how we know international law today. But there's such an amazing history to it, and such a vast area of its reach, that I find it to be one of the most fascinating areas of both research, study, and practice, because I want to specialize in investment arbitration, which is again international law, but it's so commercial. But my areas of interest include nuclear disarmament and public international law, which is very theoretical. And I could do both these things while specializing in one subject. So I just think just the number of things that you could do with it are so manifold that it was just something that drew me in again and again, because every time I went into a new area of research, I found something new about it, something more invigorating about it, something that I enjoyed doing.
That's great, man. That's amazing. Let's move on to a short audience interaction. Any questions or comments, please write it on the chat. We'll be picking at max 1 or 2. Any questions, you can write in the chat. Okay, I think we covered. Okay, we have one. This is by Maulik. So, who has been a figure of inspiration to you for international law?
No one really. I mean, it's I wasn't inspired by anyone to take international law. I was my inspiration to do law came from very personal reasons. Um, but for international law, it was specifically my own choosing by virtue of learning the subject on my own, experiencing it. And that's how I would recommend all of you to develop your own passions, not by following someone, because it's often easy to see someone doing something and feeling like that's the track that I want to go into. But it's an even better idea to do things on your own and see how they work for you and then decide. So no real inspiration for me in doing international law.
Okay, this is something which I really like. This is by Ila Chakravarti, which is that did you have any major pivot in choosing your career path?
No, unfortunately, again, I'm going to give a very boring answer. I tried very hard to go away from law when I was in my 10th standard. So I'm not sure how the new education policy impacts you guys, but we had to choose our streams in the 11th standard. And I was almost certain that I'm going to take science in my 11th and 12th and go as far away from law as possible. But I mean, when I thought about it and I felt, what is it that I'm going to do in something that's a non-law profession, I came up with absolutely nothing. So for me, it was a very vanilla career path with no pivots, nothing interesting, only knowing that law is the only thing that I could possibly do well at. And that was the only thing that I thought. But a pivot within law, I never thought that I would be sitting in London working at a law firm over here. My idea was always to do my master's and start litigation in front of courts in India. In the third year of my 5-year undergraduate degree, this opportunity presented itself where I could apply for international law firms. And again, as I said, I was interested in international law, international investment arbitration, things that I did not think that the Indian jurisdiction, which was great for other things, but it's something that I did not think that I could really find a place in within India. I decided that I'm going to apply for these international law firms to do arbitration and international dispute resolution. And because at the time of applying in my third year, I realized that I was able to be in a position where I could apply because your marks mattered a lot. So when I was entering into the first year of university, obviously you don't think about how many marks you're going to get in the third year. You often don't know if you're going to get marks or not. But because my academic record was decent enough, I decided I'd take a shot, and now I'm here. So that was pretty unique. I guess that's a pivot.
Okay, so I'm going to merge one or two questions. A lot of people are asking if you have any material, any books in mind which you can recommend them to become better debaters.
Not really. I think every book that you'll read is going to help you, especially if it's a non-fiction book. There's no real book that I went to learn debating. It's a very visceral skill, so you often learn more from seeing than reading. And I would think that the best way of you preparing the histrionics of debating is by watching people do it. So go on YouTube. That would help you a lot more than any book for your knowledge base, which will assist you a lot more in debating than the histrionics. Please read any non-fiction book that's written by a good author.
I like this one. I would ask this one. This is by Aryan. Basically, Aryan's asking that, as novice debaters, they're going to be nervous because they're speaking for the first time, and by obviously you also be in that position sometime or the other. What is your tip for these guys, the novice debaters speaking for the first time, very nervous, full of energy? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I mean, getting nervous is something that's very natural. It's a very good thing. It means that you care about what you're doing. I wouldn't be ever ashamed of nervousness before you go on and speak. I have been very nervous before many of my debates. The best way of tackling nervousness is by developing confidence in your own abilities. Now, there are two ways that you could do that. The first is that having a sort of self-assurance that you've done everything that you could, right? Let me give you an example. When I was in school, most of the debates used to be prepared debates, right? So you had to, I had to, I'm not sure if others did. When I was really young in the 6th and 7th standard, I used to memorize all my debates and then speak it out when I used to go, in the hope that I don't forget. So I used to get very, very nervous before memorizing them. And it has happened, it has happened more than once that I have just gone blank on stage, right? And that is the most nervous that you can possibly feel, when you just completely go blank. And the way that you counter it is realizing it's a setback that really doesn't matter that much, and which is why the thought that I gave before the questioning was concluded was that, remember, it's just an activity, right? What's the worst that can happen? Let's do a best case, worst case scenario of you debating, right? The best case scenario of you debating is that you enjoyed the activity, you find it helps you, develops your thoughts and speaking abilities, develops your personality, and you enjoy it and you start doing it a lot more. What is the worst case scenario of you becoming nervous and doing really bad at debate? At the end of the day, not more than 5 or 10 people would get to know about it. That's the worst case scenario. 5 or 10 people know that you messed up one small competition in a world that has over 7 billion people, right? So the best case scenario is you engaging in an activity that you will end up enjoying, and the worst case scenario is that you tried something new and it didn't work out, right? Should it mean that you shouldn't do it again? I don't think so. I think you do it again and again till you start becoming a lot better at it, or you decide that this is not something that's for me. And both of them are equally valid and equally good. So that's the way I would tackle with nervousness. Always take it as just another activity. Nothing happens if you do badly at it. A lot of good can come out of you doing well at it.
I'm going to merge 2 or 3 questions. So a lot of questions over here about when you have an unfavorable motion. Suppose the motion presented is not in line with, let's say, your interest, or let's say it is not really favorable to you. You are at a disadvantage when you say a motion. What do you do then?
Yeah, there are many reasons why you might think that a motion is disadvantageous to you, but it's often a good idea to convince yourself of the case that you are going to be arguing, right? There are often motions that are so obviously skewed in the favor of the other side. Let me think of one off the top of my head. This house believes that violence is a solution, right? Any rational or decent individual would probably think that this motion is skewed in favor of the opposition, because it's easier to convince someone that violence is not a solution. And the way you approach these motions is, again, think of where violence has worked, right? And convince yourself of those points. Think of where civil disobedience becomes a good thing, where riots have toppled over governments in the Middle East, right? When Bhagat Singh went to the erstwhile council and threw bombs in it, right? Or what, make-believe bombs in it. Because making people listen was the only way that you go forward from there. So there's never a motion that is so skewed in the favor of the other side that it becomes impossible to debate or argue. So always remember that there's always scope for argumentation, and it'll only be a much better case that you would put forward if you are on the harder side of the motion. So I would take it as an advantage, because people are not expecting unique or good arguments from you, and you would be in a position to give them. Remember, there's always scope for argument, and also don't try not to think too much about, oh, I'm going to lose because this motion position is favored on the other side. It's never the case that it's very difficult to argue. You'll always find some arguments for it. So just think things through.
Okay, I think this is the last question for the evening. Can you tell us about the crucial point in life when you realize that public speaking is your field of interest? Basically, that turning point in your life.
I can't think of there being a turning point as such. When I was in the 5th standard, I felt really bad when I was not even asked to audition for a debate. That's when I knew that I cared about this, and this was a 10-year-old boy feeling really bad about not having a chance to go for an inter-school debate. So I knew I cared about the activity since then. I guess it has a lot to do with the fact that I always saw myself using my voice in some way throughout my journey, and just doing my first debate was something that I felt, at least, was something that I have always wanted to do and something that I would love to do again and again. So I was lucky enough for my first debate to be an activity that I enjoyed, which is why I encourage everyone to try it out in whatever shape or form that they must. Because if it works for you, then it really works very well, and it develops you in a way that I would be absolutely certain about what I was post my life in school has a direct correlation to me engaging in debating. There's no question about it.
But any last remarks? Any tips for these guys on how they can improve their debating skills?
No, as I said, it's the only thing that I would say is that I'm glad that the people who are participating in this debate are doing it. It's a bold, strong, confident step, which is very commendable and laudable. Don't let anyone tell you that these are things that can't be learned. They can be learned and they can be done really well. Just keep practicing, keep working hard, and keep reading, and I'm sure all of you will do really, really well.
Pranay, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a fruitful session. I'm sure all of us have learned so much from debating from you. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Samir. The pleasure was all mine. So good to see you again.
Thank you so much, Pranay. Participants, fixtures of the school category will be out tonight on the website. Your teachers in charge will be notified about it. If you have any queries regarding the format, please contact me or Rishabh. If you're interested in the career of law, check out our career counseling program. I feel it will be really fruitful for you. Thank you all so much for joining us. Pranay, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all. That's it from our side. Thank you all. Bye-bye.